Hey everyone, welcome back. Tonight's story starts off normal, but what happens next is truly terrifying. Stay until the end because the ending will leave you shocked. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and share. And drop a comment below if you're brave enough to watch until the end. Now, let's get into the story.
I have told parts of this before in drunken bar conversations and late-night DMs, but I've never read it out loud and walked anyone through it the way I did that week in October. I say that week because the days blurred after the third night and because time itself started to feel unreliable out there. If you want the short version, I drove north, set up camp along Black Creek, and the things I saw and recorded still don't make sense. If you want the longer one, if you want every detail so you can decide whether I'm a liar, a sleep-deprived photographer, or something worse, then sit back and listen. I'm going to tell you what happened night by night because the order matters. Night 1, drive, hunger. And the wrong kind of quiet, I took a morning flight into Missoula and rented a pickup with more miles than sense. The road to Black Creek narrows after the last gas station and turns into gravel that eats brake pads. My destination was a pullout marked only on the topo map I'd printed. I wasn't scouting for ghosts. I shoot elk and cougars in the kind of fog-lit river shots that get likes on social. I wanted the place because of a late-autumn light pole, thin, pale, and perfect where the valley fog gathers at dusk. I'd been chasing that light all year. By the time I reached the creek, the map's topo lines had dissolved into real hills, and the GPS icon on my phone did that obnoxious spinning when it can't lock. No bars, of course. The sky was a polished nickel blue, late October cold threading down my jacket. Yellow larches freckled the slopes, and the creek itself glinted between tangles of alder. I tell you the weather because the weather matters. Not a cloud, not much wind, a low pressure that makes everything sound just a hair softer. It's the wrong kind of quiet, the kind that tells you nothing is moving because everything has stopped moving. I set up in an old logging clearing, a place the trees hadn't returned to yet. My tent was a two-person, the cheap kind with zippers I'd fixed with duct tape last summer. I brought the usual kit, Nikon, 3 lenses, tripod, external hard drives, a satellite messenger tucked deep in my dry bag more for emergency bookmarking than expectation. I like analog routines, fuel stove, 2 liters of water, dehydrated chili, and the comfort of precise gear. That night I made soup, read the map, checked camera batteries. The clearing felt big and exposed, and I liked it. The silence didn't gnaw at me the way it does when you walk into a city plaza at 2 a.m. And everything's dead, it felt deliberate, as if the forest had sucked itself inward. A soundless patch I woke at some impossible hour, 2:14 a.m. By the watch on my phone that stubbornly thought it knew the time, because the world outside had changed. The tent walls were lit with a pale, diffused glow. I sat up and unzipped the front half an inch and pressed my ear to the mesh. There was nothing, no creek burble, no insects, no owl. Normally the forest is loud with small rhythms, beetles on leaves, the rasp of squirrels, the occasional distant huff of something larger. That night the air outside smelled faintly of metal and hay, like standing at the back of a warehouse. You know the smell. I was a little smug, best laid plans, right, and I told myself I'd sit up with the camera. I mounted the Nikon on the tripod, set it to time-lapse at 2-minute intervals, not because I expected anything, but because I've caught odd weather and foxes and the sort of high. Thin aurora that sometimes sneaks down from the pole. My hand shook when I pressed the shutter. That first night, the shake was the easiest explanation for everything that followed. The triangle lights, they appeared 2 nights in. I'd spent the day hiking out along the creek. Got a few good long lens shots of deer at the far bend and climbed to a ridge to watch the valley go orange. The temperature dropped fast after dusk. I was back at camp before the last light died but left the tripod out. I told myself I wanted the foreground focused for later frames. Around 9:10 p.m., 3 points of light slid up from behind the tree line like slow, deliberate fireflies. At first I thought hunters with flashlights, maybe a ranger, maybe idiots with ATVs. They were triangular, three distinct bulbs in a perfect equilateral formation, edges that didn't waver or strobe. The formation moved as one piece, carrying no sound that I could hear even when I stood with my hand on the tent zipper. We've all seen drones now, and I'm not an idiot about that possibility. Drones make a high, mechanical whine you can feel through the ground. These were silent the way a moon is silent, but darker somehow, like they absorbed the edges of the trees as they passed. I watched until my hands went numb. When they rose above the canopy, they kept their formation, moved gently across the stars, and then paused. Not hovered in our human sense, paused as if something were considering the valley. For a full minute they did nothing that suggested a propeller, a bulb, or any moving parts. Then they tilted and the beam from the center point elongated, spilling slow light down through the branches. The forest didn't rustle. Even the deer sound that had been there earlier seemed gone. I hustled out with the camera. I got a few frames. The sensor did what it does, turning light into lines, but the photos didn't capture what I had felt. The way the light seemed to make the air thicker. The way the silence became a presence. A patch of dead earth in the morning. Curiosity pushed me out before the stove could get going. I followed the path where the lights had seemed to hang, stepping over old root and mud, and the earth felt compacted, like a packed-down campsite. Then I saw the circle. It was a perfect circle, maybe 8 meters across. The grass and small brush were dead, gray and brittle. There was no scorch, no singed leaves, no ash, nothing that screams fire or chemicals. It was like someone had taken a cookie cutter to the forest floor and pressed out a clean, sterile hole. The edges were neat, moss around the circumference was intact, only the interior flat and lifeless. I knelt and smelled the ground. There was that metallic, hay-like odor again. When I pushed my glove into the soil, it gave way with an odd dryness, as if everything volatile had been pulled out. I dug shallow with my hands until my knuckles met clay, and then I stopped. It didn't make sense. Nature doesn't make perfect circles. Giant footprints, wrong spacing. I found the prints less than 30 meters from the circle, leading away into thicker timber. I mean prints, the kind that are not shoe-shaped but are depressions in the leaf litter and duff, like someone had walked barefoot with gigantic feet. Each print was about the size of a child's bathtub, maybe longer. The stride between prints was wrong, too far. If you tried to walk with that spacing and keep balance, you'd defall. The spacing suggested a stride 5 to 6 meters long. Whatever made them took steps the way a machine or an animal with an incredible span would. There were no drag marks. Each impression was clean, the limbs of the plants compressed down and unbroken. The prints didn't smell like anything, though the air nearby hummed with that same faint metallic tang. I photographed them at every angle, every scale. I couldn't help myself. I was collecting evidence like a professional and a fool at once. The feeling of being watched after the prints, I was not brave. I felt observed. The hair on my neck kept reflexively lifting even during the day. You can rationalize this: anxiety after a night awake, caffeine, the fact that I'd been out here alone for 2 days. But there is a specific physical pressure when you are being watched. It settles behind your eyes and makes your breathing angular. I started leaving a radio playing static at low volume when I left camp now. People will say that's nonsense, that sound carries and startles animals. I say it because something in me wanted human noise, anything that would push back at the bubble of quiet. Electronics started acting up that evening. The small things first. My headlamp flashed with a strange purple bleed. The LCD on my handheld GPS pixelated until whole chunks of the map were replaced with gray blocks. My satellite messenger took 3 tries to send a test message and gave me a signal lock that said, in ambiguous language, partial. The big cameras were more stubborn. The Nikon's battery indicator would drop from full to empty in moments, then read full again. I chalked it up to a failing third battery and the cold. I've been cold in the field plenty, but equipment is the honest ledger in the woods. When it starts to lie, you know you're past easy explanation. A figure in the dark the second night while reviewing frames on the back of my camera. I thought I saw movement at the edge of the clearing. I told myself it was a deer or a ghost of a pine branch. I unzipped the tent and there was briefly a tallness between trunks. It stood upright as a man would stand, narrow but impossibly elongated, as if the proportions were almost wrong. It didn't move the way animals move. It stood and turned its head, if that's what it did, and the angle of the motion felt too smooth to be a human neck. I didn't have time to register a face. Whatever it was seemed to exist in the slices between air and shadow. I grabbed the tripod, stumbling. My sneakers smacked the wet leaves. The figure didn't flee, it stepped back into the darker wood and disappeared. When I turned on my headlamp and swept the beam, everything looked ordinary. Trunks, undergrowth, the faint trail my boots had been making. Later, while looking at the frame-by-frame playback, I found a clip with a smudge of something upright among the trunks. The pixelation in that area was heavy, like the camera sensor didn't know what to make of it. When I zoomed in later on my laptop, the smudge became a silhouette with a vertical streak, no limbs discernible. Almost as if the camera had caught the negative space of a person. Camera footage and the wrong kind of playback. I set up extra cameras after that. One on time-lapse, one on continuous with an external battery, and one with night vision because I wanted to catch whatever followed me. The main camera's card corrupted halfway through the third night, more on that in a minute, so I have only the secondary and the night vision clips intact. I'm mentioning these details because when you listen to people tell strange things, you have to mark what can be checked and what can't. This is the checked stuff at 4:22 a.m. On night 3, the night vision camera outside recorded a column of light moving slowly across the tops of the trees. The video is grainy, the kind of green smudge you expect with infrared, but the shape of the light maintains an angular form as it passes. The clip also records a low-frequency sound I didn't hear at the time, a deer-like whine or an electronic moan. When I slowed the playback to half speed on my laptop, my speakers made a harmonic I haven't been able to reproduce on other systems. My friend who runs the podcast engineering group told me later that the waveform had a regularity that matched no known animal call and matched only certain types of oscillation you see in Specialized. Electrical equipment, the corrupted file was from my primary camera. It had a 9-second clip followed by a blank that my recovery software couldn't parse. I sent it to a friend who works with imaging for research, and he told me the file header was intact but the frames were anomalous. The pixels in the middle frames were rearranged in a way his tools didn't expect. He used a term I found oddly clinical for the raw horror I felt hearing it: non-coherent data. The last night, the approach, and the final sighting by night 4 I was not sleeping. I tried to pack, but the straps of the pack felt like the weight of all my rationalizations. The satellite messenger would finally send messages, and yet something in me bristled at calling for a ranger. What would I tell them? There were triangle lights. Nobody comes for that, and I knew that, so I stayed. It was colder, with a wind that arrived in imperfect gusts and left the trees rattling in a way that sounded like distant applause. I had the camp heater, extra gloves, and the night vision camera trained on the circle and prints because I needed to see what happened, and because, if I'm honest, I wanted proof for later. Not proof to convince anyone, proof to hold against the night like a talisman. At 1:03 a.m., the night vision picked up motion, something large moving just beyond the far tree line. The footage is the thing I replay more than anything because it refuses to be tidy. At first it looks like the trees bowing under wind, but the motion isn't consistent with wind. A line of trunks moves in a wave, then separates, and through that gap an elongated shape crosses, slow, deliberate. Step after impossible step, it moved like a person with the body proportions shifted, hips and shoulders narrow, spine unnaturally straight, but when it took a step, the entire stalked motion displaced the undergrowth in a way that suggested weight, not agility. It passed just outside the cleared circle, close enough that the night camera recorded what looked like the impression of something enormous pressing down on the leaf litter. The frame has a moment where the infrared bloom catches a vertical column, maybe what I'd seen earlier, and then the video shifts. For 3 frames, the figure's outline snaps into something more defined. An angular head, a long neck, a torso that resolves and then dissolves again. The frames are jagged like someone scratching a negative. At 1:06 a.m., the lights I'd seen earlier returned. Not above the trees this time, but hovering a few feet above the ground at the center of the dead circle. The camera recorded a faint glow, low and triangular, and a bloom of infrared flare across the camera lens. I wasn't watching on the monitor when it happened. I was at the tent zipper, breathing so hard my lungs felt full of wet paper. The sound the video captured then, the low, harmonic vibration, vibrated the tent poles in their sleeves. My teeth ached from it. I remember the light hitting the tent like a hand. It flattened my world into a tight focus, breath, canvas, the smell of my own fear. The sound began to modulate into something like language without words, an arrangement of tones that sat behind my sternum. Part of my brain cataloged this like a professional, frequency, amplitude, reaction. Part of me curled inward. I left the tent. The clearing was almost blinding. The triangular lights hung there, low enough I could see features in the undergrowth. The grass in the dead circle looked like it had been chemically bleached. Then the lights moved with the grace of something that never needed to hurry. One of them swept slowly across the ground in a beam that skimmed plant tops, and I cannot explain what it did. Leaves didn't brown, stems didn't smolder. Instead, they seemed to thin, as if moisture was being folded out of them. The beam paused on a small sapling, and the sapling vibrated, then simply fell over as though the ground beneath had become absent. I backed up and tripped on my own tripod. For one insane, monumental second I thought about the satellite messenger, how simple and human it felt. I could have hit the SOS and left. I didn't. The reason is stupid and ugly. I wanted the footage. I wanted proof. I wanted to be the guy who could come back and show the world the impossible. What followed is a blank in my memory with edges I can feel. I remember noise, the harmonic turning into a pressure like being underwater, the sound of my camera smashing against something. And then the absolute stillness of a forest with a collapsed tent in it. When I came to, dawn was close and the world had that light that feels like spilled milk. My things were scattered. The tripod was bent like pretzel steel. One of my camera bodies was gone. The satellite messenger lay on its side and had a smear of something dark across the casing that cleaned away into reflected leaves when I rubbed it with my sleeve. The dead circle was still there, but it had a new print in the center, a single, enormous depression, as if someone had sat down. I left Black Creek that morning with as much gear as I could carry. And the rest I threw over the bank into the creek and told myself I'd come back for it in better light. When you're terrified, you make practical decisions that later sound foolish. I drove until the road turned to blacktop, and only then did I stop and call anyone. The footage I kept of all the footage. The two clips I preserved best are the night vision of the figure moving along the edge of the clearing, and the secondary camera's shot of the lights at ground level. The figure clip distorts under playback, pixels tear at certain frames, and when I handed files to friends for analysis. Some of them said their software spat warnings about nonlinear artifacts. Another friend suggested electromagnetic interference. Nobody offered a clean explanation. The second clip, the one with the lights, has a sound layer now when I isolate it in my editing program. Tones that if you squint and let the volume push at your jaw, pattern into a rhythm like short breaths. People have asked for the clip to listen to themselves on stream. I won't post it. Not because I'm precious about it, but because something in those tones tears at the edges of what sane people can listen to and remain entirely themselves. When I sped it up or slowed it down, I found structures that looked alarmingly like repeats, like someone trying variations on an idea. My audio engineering friends told me there was a carrier frequency underlying the whole thing, one that looked alarm-like when mapped. That's all I'll say. The last night at home, I left with what I thought was the last of the convincingly weird evidence. A handful of images of the prints, the corrupted primary file, and a thumb drive. The night vision files, and that small, stubborn taste of honey metal in my mouth that sometimes stays after you smell something volatile. For the first week I stayed with friends and didn't sleep well. I made excuses and drank coffee to fill the dark holes in my day. On the 7th night after Black Creek, I woke at 3:14 a.m. to the sound of my old Sony turning on in the living room. It It played a single tone, an odd, low harmonic, like the overgrown insect hum in the night vision files, then stopped. The speaker had no battery, it was connected to power. I checked the files. My corrupted primary file was on my laptop, unchanged. But the small external drive I'd put the night vision on had a new file appended at the end. It was 9 seconds long. 9 seconds is almost nothing. I listened to it 3 times and then called a friend who'd analyzed the footage. He told me without irony that the audio had an afterimage. It lingered, he said, which is not a technical term, but it was accurate. The file ends with the softest whisper of something like a name. It sounded like my name, but not quite. He said it was probably pareidolia, the human brain hunting pattern in noise. We argued and then drank and then didn't talk about it for a week. Now, months later, I still have the prints saved as images, the corrupted file on cold storage. And the memory of pressure in the tent like the hand of someone checking a pulse. The final piece and the thing that keeps me awake is something small that I found in my coat pocket 3 days after I returned to Bhopal to visit family. A shard in my pocket, it was a sliver of bark, perfectly polished on one face, as if something had run a blade across it. In the grain were 3 tiny abrasions set in an equilateral triangle, spaced like the lights I'd seen in the sky, precise and deliberate. The bark had the same metallic hay smell when I brought it to my nose. I'd left no trace of that tree near my tent. The bark wasn't from the species in the clearing. When I asked the friend who runs botanical surveys, he told me the pattern of the grain matched trees from a range farther north than Black Creek. He looked over at me and said, "You weren't alone." I wanted to punch him when he sounded so certain. I keep the shard in a small envelope. Some nights I hold it in my hand and I can feel a faint vibration, like a minor toothache through the skin. Most nights I don't. Most nights I tell myself that the whole story, lights, prints, figure, corrupted files, is a confluence of tiredness and bad weather and the human tendency toward pattern. Then I look at the photos and the footage and the envelope with the bark, and I stop telling myself that, what I think, finally I have no clever explanation. I have speculation and I have a stack of evidence that refuses to be tidy. I am told sometimes that people have seen lights in the sky for centuries and that there are always a raft of mundane reasons for them. Drones, atmospheric phenomena, military exercises. But the circle of dead vegetation, the prints, the way the forest went soundless. The low harmonic recorded across separate devices, those things sit together like puzzle pieces that do not make any known picture. I will not tell you they were aliens. I will not tell you they were government craft. I will say this, however you choose to make sense of Black Creek, make sure your explanation accounts for the things that are hardest to fit, the silence, the circle, the prints. The feeling of a presence like a weight against your chest, and the bark with the 3 marks that fit the lights, and one last thing. A week ago I opened my mail. In the envelope that looked like every other bill was a small square of glossy card. On it, printed in a clean sans serif font, was a single line, "Keep looking up." There was no return address, no signature. The card sat on my coffee table, smug and casual. Later that night, after I thought I had convinced myself to laugh it off, I found a hairline scratch on my studio window, 3 scratches in the glass. Arranged in the exact pattern of that equilateral triangle, I keep the window covered now. I close the curtains early. I don't go out looking for lights anymore, not because I'm afraid, but because the forest taught me something I didn't want to know. The kind of things that watch you from the dark have patience. They don't need to hurry. They are very good at waiting. If you ever find yourself in a quiet place and the world goes wrong, if the insects stop and the trees hold their breath, turn on some ordinary human noise. Keep lights on. Bring friends, don't rationalize away the small things. Some pieces of the world are not opinion, they are fact. And if you find a perfect circle in the grass, take a picture. But after that, close the camera and go home.
So, story ended. I hope you like this story and you watch the end. So please like, share and subscribe to my channel to support it. And we are back in another story. So bye bye.